Good morning, honorable members. Good morning, Chairperson. I believe at this point, the chair is already ready to start. I see him on the screen. He's still connecting. I see some wheels going around, so we should be starting right away. If Edna is on the call, maybe she could start with the logistics.
Good morning, honorable members, and good morning, participants. Maybe I can just start with the housekeeping issues. Members may need to take note that the session is being recorded and it should be shared to all the honorable members and participants in all the 3 languages. The chair will start by giving his welcome remarks, and afterwards he'll call upon the presenter to make the presentation. Honorable members who wish to ask questions following the presentations will be free to do so. There's a symbol on this Zoom application. When you click on participants, there's somewhere where you can raise your hand. And so if you wish to ask a question or raise a concern, please, you can go ahead and raise your hand and the chair will pick on you to ask a question. Members are also advised to utilize the chat box to drop in a question or communicate with the chair or myself. And in case the members may wish to clap for the presenter or anyone, when you come to the bottom right, there's an icon where there's more, and there's an emoji where you can clap or like the presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chair.
Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with all protocol observed, greetings to all of you gathered here today for this online seminar. Kindly allow me the honor of recognizing the presence of the Deputy Chair of this committee, Honorable Ruth Mendez, and the committee clerk who has just addressed us, Ms. Edna Kanguyu. I would like to thank you for affording me the opportunity to address you at this moment. I wish to welcome you all to this important engagement intended to update the members on the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations, as well as its legal and institutional architecture. This engagement is an opportunity for honorable members of the Committee on Trade, Industry, Finance, and Investment to share and exchange knowledge, discuss expected outcomes, and create a common understanding even before the trade agreement is enforced. Honorable members and distinguished participants, from the outset, let me state that this meeting could not have come at a better time than now, considering that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the dynamics of trade operations in Southern Africa and beyond. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, you may wish to note that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement envisages liberalization of trade, both in goods and services, in the first stage of the negotiations, and will extend to investment, competition, policy, and intellectual property in the second phase. The agreement is therefore all-encompassing. It is expected to encourage African economies to establish practical ways of expanding their manufacturing potential. Honorable members, distinguished participants, it is gratifying to note that some countries, which are also members of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, have ratified the trade agreement. Therefore, this meeting will create an opportunity to learn the level of preparedness regarding the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement in those countries. Honorable members, distinguished participants, allow me to acknowledge the recognition by a number of Southern African development community governments of the role of members of parliament by constitutionally reposing the power to approve all international agreements in their legislatures. Pursuant to this power, such agreements go through intensive scrutiny and legislative process before they can be acceded to or ratified by the executive. On this account, therefore, I urge the members of this committee whose governments are yet to approve and ratify this trade agreement to be ambassadors of regional economic integration through this agreement. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, even as we gather to discuss the update on the after today, as honorable members, we need to be alive to the fact that this trade agreement will be implemented in an environment which is substantially different from what was initially anticipated. As we are all aware, the trade environment is currently grappling with the invisible hand of the global COVID-19 pandemic, which is characterized by border closures, lockdowns, and unprecedented restrictions on the supply and movement of goods and services across borders. Be that as it may, even amidst the pandemic, it is important that we think beyond the immediate in as far as negotiations for the agreement and international trade are concerned. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area will not be easy under the new normal, given that nations have put in place various measures to facilitate the movement of goods and services while containing the spread of this deadly disease. In any case, I am confident that members will benefit greatly from this engagement as they will be acquainted with many important issues concerning the agreement during the engagement. Cognizant of this, I urge all members to stay focused on the proceedings and to actively engage the experts who are in our midst in order to maximize the benefits for the people we represent, the citizens of SADC. I wish the meeting fruitful deliberations, and I duly declare it open. At this moment, may I invite our guest speaker to take to the floor. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Honourable Chair, Deputy Chair, and Secretary General. Thank you so much for this invitation. I think, as our Chair has indicated, we could not have imagined even 5 months ago that we would currently be where we are amidst a global pandemic. We also recognize, as the Chair has indicated, that this has elicited very protectionist measures by a number of states, not only amongst ourselves as SADC member states, but across the continent and globally. And therefore, we have to think again about the role of trade And this is why the Continental Free Trade Area becomes such an important instrument for Africa's integration, not only to boost trade amongst ourselves, but also for us to integrate more competitively, more effectively into the global economy. It is now my great pleasure to share a presentation with you, honorable members, and I look forward to engaging in some discussion with you. Honorable members, our webinar is divided into two. As you know, we will meet again tomorrow morning. And so this first presentation takes a look at the overall architecture of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, provides an update on the negotiations, but importantly also takes a look at the relationship between the African Continental Free Trade Area and other very important flagship projects of the African Union. This is where we will be taking a look at how we can address the deficits that we face in terms of our industrial production, how we can leverage the agricultural initiatives on the continent, and also expand and diversify our productive capacity of essential goods. As we've realized now during COVID, we have very limited capacity on the continent to produce pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, and other essential medical equipment that we need for a pandemic. I think it is also true that this pandemic will not be the last we see globally and on the continent. And therefore, for us as SADC also to consider how we prepare to engage going forward to address future crises and pandemics. And this is where the AFCFTA also has an important role to play. But let's start with setting the scene for the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is a very important continental initiative for the integration of African economies. We remain divided, fragmented, and we also keep in mind that when we take a look at African countries, 33 of the world's 47 least developed countries are African. 14 of those are also landlocked, bringing specific trade challenges. And therefore, a continental integration arrangement becomes all the more important, given the fact that COVID has exposed our vulnerabilities, the particular challenges that informal cross-border traders face, the majority of whom are women in sub-regions. So very important that we see the AFCFTA now in a much more dramatic and important global context. It is a free trade agreement. It is anchored in binding legal instruments. And we have to recognize that member states of the African Union who are negotiating the agreement made significant and impressive progress early on in the process. And we'll say a little bit about where we stand in the negotiations very briefly. I think as our honorable chairs indicated, this is an ambitious and a comprehensive agenda that we have outlined. It is much more than a free trade agreement. It is also a flagship project of the African Union. And it is in this context that there are significant benefits to be leveraged from the AFCFTA. The aim, as the agreement indicates, is to boost intra-Africa trade, integration and development, creating an integrated market for goods, services, promoting cross-border movement of capital, investment, and persons. The negotiations take place under the auspices of the African Union Commission, but are, as all of our regional integration negotiations are, member state driven. Honorable members, this is extremely important to keep in mind. The member states are driving the process. As the Honorable Chair has indicated, there are two distinct phases of the negotiations. The first phase focuses on trade in goods and services. The second phase on investment, competition, and intellectual property. Phase 2 issues, as we recognize, are absolutely critical in terms of moving the boundaries of governance, but also very important because, of course, investment will be critical for us to expand and diversify our industrial sectors. As we integrate continentally, of course, the possibility of anti-competitive practices that transcend national borders becomes much more of a possibility. Intellectual property issues, this is an area where we have a lot of work to do to protect our biodiversity, our traditional knowledge, and many areas of innovation and development that are particularly important also to boost our productive capacity. It creates, the agreement does, a number of institutions. There are no supranational institutions in the sense that we have, for example, in the European Commission, but there will be a unique secretariat. And this will be hosted by Ghana in Accra. We've recently seen the appointment of the Secretary General of the Secretariat, but because of COVID, we have a pause in the implementation and the establishment and the development of that institution. It is very important to keep in mind, honorable members, and this will be the topic specifically that we focus on tomorrow, that regional economic communities and existing trade arrangements will continue to exist. So this extremely important. The AFCFTA adds to the existing ecosystem of regional integration on the continent, filling the gaps between the regional economic communities that exist already. So for example, countries in Southern Africa, in SADC, do not have any trade agreements with their partners in West Africa or North Africa yet. The AFCFTA now focuses on building trade relationships among those formerly disconnected trading partners. This, honorable members, is the AFCFTA legal and institutional design. This is what the agreement looks like. And you will see that it covers a very important area of not only trade in goods and trade in services, but also, and this is covered in the blue section on the right-hand side, the phase 2, the new generation trade issues. But let's briefly just have a look at the protocol on trade in goods. This is very important. It has a number of annexes. There are 9 annexes. Important to keep in mind, for a free trade area, we need schedules of tariff concessions, preferential tariff concessions. We need rules of origin. We need instruments that talk to customs and border management, trade facilitation, elimination of non-tariff barriers, standards, technical barriers to trade, and sanitary, phytosanitary measures, and of course, trade remedies and safeguards. We also focus on the protocol on trade and services. This is a very important one. If we take a look at the contribution of services to our economies, it is growing in significance, both in terms of its contribution to GDP, but also employment and export earnings. This, very sadly, honorable members, is of course where we see a dramatic impact of COVID on, for example, the tourism, the logistics, the transport sectors. Our tourism sectors across the continent and across the globe have virtually ground to a halt, posing very significant challenges to our communities who depend on those sectors. The annexes on the trade in services include schedules of specific commitments, MFN exemptions, in other words, where we make exemptions for particular relationships where we do not treat all trade partners equally. There's also an annex on air transport services. Keep in mind that at the beginning of 2018, our member states of the African Union adopted the Yamoussoukro Agreement. This is the open skies policy for Africa, promoting cross-border and cross-continent sub-region transport, air transport. Of course, with COVID, this is a sector which has been severely impacted, and this will need a lot of support going forward to take a look at how we revitalize that very important sector. Member states have agreed on a list of priority sectors, and we'll have a look at those in a little bit later. There's also a framework on regulatory cooperation. Honourable members, services are regulatory intensive. So for example, if we take a look at road transport, it is those regulations which relate to axle load limits, to the size of containers that may be transported on our roads, that really determine how effectively we can use that transport infrastructure. So harmonization of some of those regulations may actually be quite important. We're aiming at this stage, and this was prior to COVID, let's keep that in mind, on regulatory cooperation. A very important protocol, honourable members, is the one on dispute settlement. This is very important should disputes arise related to the terms and conditions of the agreement, that we do have means of resolving those disputes. What we have done as AU member states is to adopt very much the model of the World Trade Organization. So if a member state has a dispute with another member state, a panel of experts will be the court, so to speak, of first instance, do an investigation, produce a report and a ruling, and it may be appealed to an appellate body, very much as we have in the WTO. Keep in mind that it is interstate dispute settlement that is provided for in the agreement. So if a private company has a dispute, it will take it to the executive, to the focal point for trade policy, the Ministry of Trade, Industry or Commerce, and that member state will take up this dispute on its behalf, very much as what happens in the WTO. This collection of instruments that we have in blue here, these are the phase 2 areas that are still to be negotiated. We have not yet started the negotiations on those, but some preparatory work developing draft texts for a protocol on competition, intellectual property and investment have been done by experts. I think, honourable members, we have to note that the level of ambition for phase 2 is that we will cooperate in these areas. And that's really important to keep in mind. We look forward to see how member states will decide how to cooperate on those particularly important areas. A brief update on where we stand at the moment. It's important to keep in mind that the agreement, the AFCFTA, was presented for the member states to sign and to adopt at an extraordinary summit in Kigali in March 2018. Member states started signing the agreement, and what we do have to keep in mind, honourable members, is that signature is a very important phase of signalling the end of the negotiations, but it does not yet bring any legal obligations. That comes when we ratify the agreement, and that is, of course, where our national parliaments play an extremely important role. And this is also where the SADC Parliamentary Forum certainly has an interest in terms of the progress of ratification. The entry into force provisions in the agreement require that 22 member states ratify the agreement, and 30 days after the 22nd ratification, it will enter into force. That happened last year, and on the 30th of May last year, the agreement entered into force. the question that we're all asking is, when will trade under the AFCFTA begin? And honorable members, what we do have to recognize is that although the agreement has entered into force, it is not yet possible to trade under that regime. And the reason is that very important negotiations are still underway. For a free trade area, the two, basic requirements are that we have preferential tariff concessions and preferential rules of origin. We are still in the process of negotiating those. And of course, COVID has unfortunately brought the face-to-face negotiating meetings, which are so important, brought those to a halt. What we have seen in the last couple of months is that member states are meeting online in virtual discussions. The technical working groups are meeting and convening. But as honorable members would certainly agree with me, when it comes to the fine print of the negotiations, a Zoom meeting is not a perfect substitute for meeting face-to-face, for having those long discussions into the small hours of the morning when we are negotiating the fine details of tariff concessions or rules of origin. So these still have to be finalized. And until then, we cannot trade under this agreement. But of course, honorable members, trade continues on the continent. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. It is simply trade under this agreement, which is not yet possible. For trade and services, what is still outstanding is that the member states have to make sector-specific commitments. And those negotiations are again very technical, and they take place on a request and offer basis. So a country like Zambia would like access to the market of Nigeria for trade and services, maybe financial services, and they would then engage in a bilateral request and offer process, and then finally make the sector commitments. So this is also still outstanding, but of course, trade and services among our member states of the African Union continues, but under this agreement, this is not yet possible. Our honorable chair referred to the ratification, and honorable members, this is a monitor, a barometer that we have at the Trade Law Center. And at this point in time, 30 countries have complied with their domestic requirements for ratification of the agreement. Honorable members would know this far better than I do, that an agreement, once the executive has completed the negotiations and they have signed off on the final text of that agreement, it then comes to Parliament with a request from the executive for approval. That is the domestic part of the ratification process. What then remains is that the executive has to take the letter of ratification, the instrument of ratification, to the depository. In this case, the depository is the African Union Commission, the chair of the African Union Commission. So at this point, we have 30 countries that have complied with the domestic requirements. 2 of those, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Cameroon, still have to take their letters of ratification to Addis. And of course, with COVID at the moment, that is not possible. We note also that of the 55 member states of the African Union, 54 have signed. The only country that has not yet signed is Eritrea. Honorable members, this is a list of the countries and when they deposited their instrument of ratification. And we can clearly see here some SADC member states, Eswatini, and if we go through, we'll find Namibia, Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's a star there, they still have to take that letter to Addis. And if we move through, we find Zimbabwe, and of course, we have South Africa here as well. So this is a listing of the countries with the dates that they have either completed their domestic process, their parliamentary approval, or ratified, sent their instrument to Addis. The question then is, when will we be able to trade under the AFCFTA? And just a little bit of detail on what is outstanding for trade in goods at this stage. We've mentioned that the two areas, tariff negotiations and rules of origins, are ongoing, but let's look at a little bit of the detail. On rules of origin, honourable members, a great deal of progress has been made, and there is a draft manual being prepared by the African Union Commission. But there are a few products, and the list is not a surprise to us. It is products which tend to be sensitive when we negotiate trade liberalization. Clothing and textiles, always a very sensitive sector. The automotive products and components has become quite an important one for many African countries. We've seen investment in many, many countries across the continent, but also among our SADC member states, including Namibia, Botswana, and a number of others, where automotive assembly or components manufacture is part of the industrial development strategy of that member state. So this has become an important one to keep in mind as well. Sugar, a very sensitive product. We know in SADC, sugar has its own trade regime. It's the only product that has a very specific trade regime. That's Annex 7 to the SADC trade protocol. And edible oils. Again, we've got a large number of countries producing edible oils, so we can expect this to be one where they have interests, they want to develop their domestic economies. Just a little bit about the level of ambition and where we stand. The member states have been very ambitious in terms of tariff liberalization. They have agreed to liberalize 90% of the tariff lines. So when we look at the tariff book, and 90% of those tariff lines will be reduced to zero. Some will be reduced to zero over a period of time, not immediately. And that's quite important to keep in mind, that when we look at the remaining 10% of tariff lines, that is divided into two components. 3% may be excluded if these are very sensitive to a member state because of employment issues, for example, or because it generates tariff revenue, which is still important for many, many countries, then they may be excluded. The other 7%, those would be the sensitive products, so we can liberalize them over a longer period of time. The impact of COVID, honorable members, is so relevant for the tariff liberalization exercise, because we are now realizing that we should make every endeavor to liberalize trade and to facilitate trade, not only amongst medical and pharmaceutical products that are so important to deal with the pandemic, but also very importantly, products that matter for food security. So we understand that some countries are really looking at the offers they will make for liberalization in a new light, which has been prompted by COVID. So very important. In the case of some countries, they may actually also say, we want to protect our pharmaceutical industry and develop it, so we don't want to open it to trade. So some new discussions have emerged as a result of COVID. Honourable members, I mentioned that the AFCFTA is also a flagship project of the African Union. And this means that we have to recognize that the AFCFTA is not just a free trade area. It is in fact a partnership endeavor among all the member states of the African Union. And there are a number of other, about 14 in total, flagship projects. Some of them we know very well. There's the Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, AIDA, Program for Infrastructure Development, CARDIP, we know very well, focusing on agriculture, the mining vision, science and technology, and of course, the BIAT program, which was adopted by the Assembly of the African Union in 2012, this provided a strong motivation to conclude a continent-wide free trade agreement. This is just a picture of all of those flagship projects. They all link together to Africa's overall development strategy, Agenda 2063. This is very important to keep in mind. We have here as well the Yamoussoukro decision. This is about the open skies, which is a very important one to keep in mind. Also, there is the protocol on free movement of people, a separate protocol, but equally important, honorable members, trade integration, regional integration more generally cannot take place if we do not have and we do not improve on free movement of people. There are also a number of support initiatives that are being developed by partners across the continent, which will support the AFCFTA. Africa's Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, which is headquartered in Cairo, Egypt, has moved beyond its traditional territory of providing trade finance. And it is providing funding and supporting a program to develop quality assurance centers. Now, this is so important for member states to be absolutely assured that products traded meet international standards and technical regulations. And again, honorable members, COVID has put new emphasis on standards. We have to make sure that all the products we trade are COVID safe. So safe trade is extremely important to protect human, animal, plant health, and the environment. So quality assurance infrastructure has to be a priority. And the Afreximbank has put a lot of money into this program. They've also made available, and this is absolutely essential when we look at trade liberalization, they have announced a $1 billion facility to deal with adjustment. And it's really to assist small countries in particular that have difficulties when liberalizing. As we know, honorable members, liberalization brings winners and losers. And very often it is the small firms, the SMEs, it is the informal cross-border traders who lose when we liberalize trade. So this is an adjustment facility to assist member states to help those firms that may be in trouble as a result of liberalization. Trade requires that we have efficient cross-border payment systems. And currently, honorable members, most trade transactions that take place on the continent are actually cleared outside the continent. So we tap into global financial markets and payment systems. So an important initiative, again, the Afreximbank and other partners are involved in the development of a Pan-African payments and settlement system. This is the continent partner of what we have in SADC already, CIRIS. So very important that we look at this. It will reduce transaction costs, some foreign exchange risks, because the aim is that we have transactions cleared in local currency. This could be a game changer. Coming back very briefly to take a look at the details of the AFCFTA institutions. I mentioned the Secretariat earlier on. Let's just look at the family, the institutional architecture that we have of institutions created by the AFCFTA. The highest decision-making body is the Assembly of the African Union. Honorable members, this provides a firm link, a firm manifestation of the link between the AFCFTA and the African Union. This is very important to keep in mind. Council of Ministers, these are the ministers of trade of the state parties. They play a very important role in the implementation and enforcement of the agreement, and they report to the Assembly through the AU, the African Union Executive Council. Then we have, as we should expect, a committee of senior trade officials. And these are our permanent or principal secretaries, the directors general of our trade ministries. They implement the council decisions, they can request investigations. This is really where a lot of the work related to the practical issues associated with the implementation of the agreement will take place. The Council of Ministers makes regulations and can make recommendations to the AU Assembly. That's quite important. The Secretariat, and we've had a lot of focus on the developments around the Secretariat and the appointment of the Secretary General, who comes from SADC, from South Africa in particular. The Secretariat will be functionally autonomous body within the AU system, again providing a link to the African Union, but with independent legal personality and autonomous of the African Union Commission. It will, however, be funded by the African Union. Headquarters will be in Accra, and we were hoping that it would be ready by 2020, but of course, COVID put a halt to that. The Secretariat's function will be monitoring and support functions with respect to trade remedies, dispute settlement, and so on. So it will also have a role looking at and monitoring the implementation of the agreement by the member states. A very important new institution provided for as well is the African Trade Observatory. This will be the repository for all trade and trade-related data. So very important that we will now have an Africa-wide institution where we will readily be able to get trade data and related data. So very important. There are other technical bodies that are also provided for, and very important, the last point on the slide, honorable members, is that for non-tariff barrier elimination, the equivalent of what we know well in SADC, East African Community, and COMESA already, tradebarriers.org, there is a continent-wide non-tariff barrier notification portal, which aims to eliminate non-tariff barriers to trade. We look very briefly at member states and what they are doing to prepare for implementation. But again, honorable members, of course, COVID has diverted our energy, our attention, and our resources. So we are dealing currently with the management of borders and permits and so on under very, very difficult conditions. But what we do have to do is to take a look at what needs to be done to make this agreement work for the private sector to start trading. New certificates of origin have to be developed, standard certificates, who will do the testing, who will issue the certificates, and so on. So there is a great deal of preparatory work required before trade can start under the AFCFTA. But COVID has really interrupted a process that we had already started. In conclusion, honorable members, just some resources. This is a small booklet, a summary of the AFCFTA agreement. It provides a little bit of data also on trade, intra-Africa trade, but we will discuss that in much more detail tomorrow. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you very much to our esteemed presenter. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, now is our time to interact with the presenter by way of questions and comments. The floor is open.
Chair, if I may, there's a question already posted on the chat. Could Shamira Ahmed probably just take the floor and ask the question, please?
Good morning, honorable members. I'm Shamira Ahmed from Research ICT Africa. My question is regarding digital trade. The Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is mentioned in the AU's digital transformation strategy, particularly with a focus on a single digital market and also negotiations for e-commerce and financial inclusion. So I'm curious, I'd like to know if there are going to be phase 3 e-commerce negotiations in the Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Chair, there's another question too from Clayton Venny. If they could also take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, I have to say thanks to Trudy for the presentation. It's very enlightening. My question relates to what Trudy mentioned when she started on slide 1, that the regional economic communities that are existing as we speak will continue to exist even after, and also their trade regime, they will continue to exist even after the AFCFTA continues or comes into force. My question was to that effect, to say there has been talk, or also is mentioned also in the AFCFTA documents, that the AFCFTA will also assist to address the issue of overlapping membership, where we have African countries belonging to more than 2 regional economic communities. Therefore, my question is, how will the AFCFTA, in terms of its legal and technical aspects, assist in solving this issue of overlapping membership of countries to different regs? Then 2, will there be therefore no replication of the situation that we had when the tripartite free trade area was formed, where we had the same, of course it's not yet operational, but there was this fear that we'll end up having another reg also then adding up to the already existing regs that we have. So this is the question that I have, that how will the AFCFTA assist to address this challenge of having the spaghetti power of overlapping reg membership in Africa? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe the last question from Honorable Epet Aglai. Honorable Aglai, you may kindly take the floor.
Thank you, Honorable Chair and Madam SG, and also our presenter. I just, in regards to the presentation that was done, I can see that we have several barriers that are affecting the implementation in regards to the negotiation process. I just wanted to know what are the barriers that are keeping us or giving us those setbacks that are preventing us from achieving the full implementation of the AFTA. Thank you.
Chair, I don't see any other question. You may probably allow Ms. Trudy to respond to the questions.
Yes, Ms. Trudy, you may go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, honourable members and Shamira, for those questions. I'll start in the order in which they came. Shamira, your question about the AU's digital transformation strategy and negotiations for e-commerce and financial inclusion and related matters. This is a really important one. A new version of the digital transformation strategy was made available towards the end of May, so not so long ago. And the issue of e-commerce, which of course is part of the overall digital transformation strategy, has been discussed in various stages of the preparatory phases for the AFCFTA. What we do have to keep in mind is that member states are not all on the same page as far as negotiations for e-commerce are concerned. So some are a little bit resistant, saying that we need time to develop domestic capacity, disciplines, and take a look at very important areas of governments before we engage in negotiations. This is, of course, also playing out when we take a look at the plurilateral agenda in the World Trade Organization, where there is a working group on e-commerce. African countries, by and large, are not enthusiastic about participating in that plurilateral process. But last week, in fact, ladies and honorable members and ladies and gentlemen, the Africa Integration Week was celebrated on the 7th of July, and there was a week of seminars and deliberations and discussions. And on one occasion, the Honorable Commissioner for Trade and Industry from the African Union Commission referred to e-commerce negotiations, and indications are that this may well begin next year. So Shamira's question about whether this will be a phase 3, it may well be, Shamira, that it forms part of the phase 2 negotiations, because we have not yet started the phase 2 on investment, competition, and intellectual property. So this was a little bit of good news, but of course we have to keep in mind that these decisions are made by the heads of state of the African Union Assembly. Now at this stage, the next summit that we have heard about is scheduled for the beginning of December. So we really are waiting for a number of important decisions to be made by the members. Keep in mind that the African Continental Free Trade Area is member state driven. You will note also that in my presentation, I have not said when trade under the AFCFTA will begin. It was supposed to be on the 1st of July. Obviously, that didn't happen for not only COVID reasons, but also because the negotiations had actually slowed down already around the sensitivity related to trade in goods disciplines, the tariffs and rules of origin. But we have no new date announced yet. That has to be announced by the AU Assembly. So we're waiting for those decisions. But I would also like perhaps just to update honorable members about an important development. An Africa-wide e-commerce platform called Sukuku.Africa was officially launched last week. And so there is impetus, certainly, among a number of member states to develop this particularly important area of the overall digital transformation strategy. But we also have to keep in mind that the digital transformation strategy and particular aspects of that strategy find expression in the trade and services negotiations. And they relate to a number of the priority services sectors, financial services, and also communication services. So it is really important that our member states and all stakeholders be discussing the priorities that should be on the table when we look at the negotiations in the sectors such as communication and financial services. And very important to keep in mind that if we think about what should be our goals, what should be driving, what should we aim for in those services negotiations, we really need to be thinking about the sector development priorities for financial services. For example, financial inclusion has to be among the top priorities. And if we have that as a top priority, what does that mean for the kind of sector commitments that we negotiate? So there's scope at this stage, and to some extent, COVID provides a pause and an opportunity for effective engagement around some of these important issues, around what should be informing those very important services negotiations. When it comes to the communication services sector as well, again, extremely important. When we take a look at the various communication sector development dimensions, it is absolutely critical for e-commerce. But I also would like to flag a very important connection between the digital trade and transformation strategy, the e-commerce agenda, and the trade facilitation agenda. Honorable members, even if we do see significant developments on e-commerce platforms, and even SMEs becoming very important in terms of the use of those platforms, goods still have to cross borders. So they will still have to go across a border where there will be checks on standards, there will be tariffs. So there is still customs and border management issues which impact e-commerce. And I think this highlights for us a very important connection between the trade and goods agenda, the trade and services agenda, and then the new generation issues such as digital transformation and e-commerce. So trade facilitation, I would really like to underscore the importance, because there's ample evidence, honorable members, that if we look at the benefits from trade liberalization and regional integration, and if we compare the benefits from eliminating tariffs with improving trade facilitation, we see that trade facilitation actually brings much more benefits. The other important point to keep in mind about trade facilitation is that if we improve our customs and border management procedures, we not only improve our competitiveness and facilitate trade amongst ourselves, but we also improve our global competitiveness, because it means the cost of trade with global trade partners will be reduced as well. So I think, Shamira, your question raises a lot of very important issues in the context of the overall AFCFTA agenda. I think the next question, which relates to overlapping membership and the continued existence of regional economic communities. Honorable members, this is a really, really important one. And we have to go back to our experience under the tripartite free trade areas. Honorable members would remember this started off as an initiative, a tripartite initiative between the three regional economic communities, SADC, EAC, and COMESA. And then our heads of state decided in October 2008 that we should conclude a tripartite free trade agreement. This was a milestone decision. And initially, the expectation was that the tripartite would resolve the problems of overlapping membership, which are particularly prevalent in East and Southern Africa. The overlap between SADC and COMESA, for example, is very important. However, when the negotiations started in 2011, member states discussed and deliberated, and they made a decision that what we should do in the tripartite free trade area is to build on what exists already, so that we would not open up negotiations about among SADC member states again. So we would retain the SADC trade regime, the COMESA trade regime, the EAC trade regime, and add and build on that. And this is where, honorable members, the term the acquis entered our regional and trade integration discourse. It's a term we borrow from the European Union and also the World Trade Organization. And it says basically, we will take where we are at the moment, what exists, and we will build on that. And the decision was then, in the context of the tripartite free trade area, that only those member states that were not together part of an existing trade arrangement, SADC, EAC, or COMESA, would be negotiating with one another. So it meant, for example, and this is quite important because there has been progress in this area, that the member states of SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, which did not have a trade arrangement with the member states of the EAC, except for Tanzania, which is part of SADC, They would be negotiating. So by July last year, the tariff negotiations between SACU and EAC had been concluded. There are still some outstanding negotiations on rules of origin, very much the same products that we've seen where we are still busy on the negotiations in the AFCFTA. But we have adopted in the AFCFTA exactly the same principle of the acquis. It's one of our negotiating principles. So it means we're not opening up SADC. We are not going to resolve the issue of overlapping membership through the AFCFTA. But keep in mind, honorable members, that at the end of the light, let's say at the end of the tunnel, what we are aiming at as African member states is an African economic community. And on the way to that, we will be establishing an Africa-wide customs union. And it's when we do that that we will be resolving the overlapping membership. But the AFCFTA, which was not envisaged by the Abuja Treaty, which is really the Pan-African plan for integration, the AFCFTA was not envisaged within that agreement. It has now become an important stepping stone towards deeper continental integration, which will eventually culminate in the African economic community. But for now, our regional economic communities and other trading arrangements, which probably means the tripartite free trade area as well, will continue to exist. Question about the barriers to the negotiations and implementation. Honorable members, I think it's not unexpected that negotiating tariff concessions and rules of origin is difficult. Many of our member states, excuse me, still get a lot of tariff revenue from the import tariff. And so therefore, liberalizing that, reducing that source of revenue will pose fiscal challenges. So we need to keep in mind that that is a very, very sensitive area. We are also talking about a time where member states are planning to develop and diversify their industrial sectors. And one way to assist that domestic industrial development is to protect domestic industries from import competition. And that means not liberalizing tariffs. So tariff negotiations are very sensitive always, and we can expect this negotiation to take quite a long time. Rules of origin are often also used to protect the domestic industry. And again, they belong together. We usually negotiate tariffs and rules of origin together. So it's not surprising. I think when it comes to the preparations for implementation, so preparing for trade under the AFCFTA, COVID has been a huge shock to our domestic institutions, to the capacity in government and related departments. And just to share with you an example, at the beginning of April, South Africa's International Trade Administration Commission, which is the agency which manages import-export permits for essential goods under COVID, but under good times as well as bad, obviously, was indicating that processing of a permit could take up to 10 working days. We can understand that our domestic institutions have been under severe stress. But it is also an opportunity for us to learn from this experience and to see where, for future pandemics and for future trade facilitation under the AFCFTA, we need to be building additional capacity now. Honourable Chair, I think those were the 3 questions. I'm not sure if there are any others at this stage.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you. Thank you,
so
Chair.
much, SG. I noticed there might be another set of questions, but with your indulgence, I have a couple of questions for Trudy. Thank you very much, Trudy, for that lucid and very engaging presentation. I'm quite excited. I notice that we are potentially a 1.4 trillion GDP as the African market, and possibly way bigger than WTO itself and NAFTA. When can Africa have an industrialization plan? That's my question number one. Question number two is the elephant in the room. Members of this committee have had to grapple with this. We deal with Chinese. That's my second question. Thirdly, we as a committee, we have also grappled with this before. How do we resolve payment systems since Africa does not have as yet a common currency? And then you also mentioned an online trading portal. I would like to think these are very expensive, and the other problem is possibly that African countries are not at the same level in terms of internet connectivity. Then the fifth input, and hopefully the last, Trudy, the components of this flagship project seem to be in limbo. What would you say in terms of speaking to a post-COVID economic stimulus? Would you suggest that this includes a package to resuscitate trade among African countries? Thank you, Madam SG, for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. These are some very challenging but also extremely pertinent questions that we have to discuss very openly and honestly. The first one about industrialization, I think, is an absolutely critical point. If we take a look at Africa's overall trade profile currently, it is true that right now, if we take into account the latest data, and I will share some slides tomorrow, only 15% of Africa's overall trade is intra-Africa trade. The reality is we are trading more than 80% of our trade with the rest of the world. And if we look at what we are trading commodities. We are trading unprocessed commodities, both mining, but also agricultural products, which means that one of the major challenges to make integration work in Africa is that we lack the capacity to produce tradable goods and services competitively. And this speaks to the issue of industrialization, and perhaps a little bit more broadly, as many analysts are now talking about, the development and diversification of productive capacity. And this is true in the agricultural sector, both in terms of diversifying what we produce, but adding value through the agro-processing activities, which links us to the industrial sector of the economy. But this perhaps is at the heart of the challenge as far as the low levels of intra-Africa trade are concerned, but also the fact that the returns on our trade remain really low. By and large, African countries are not price setters in the global market. We are price takers for the commodities. So the prices of commodities are determined on global exchanges by buyers, whether it be in Asia, whether it be in the US or in Europe. So this really is the foundational issue. And what we've seen in the last 10 years very definitely is at sub-regional level, this has been recognized. So it was no surprise that in April 2014 at an extraordinary summit, we had a focus specifically on industrialization and industrial development in SADC. And I think we recognize across the continent that industrialization is not only a national imperative, it is, of course, but it also has a very strong regional dimension. And it's in that regional dimension in particular that we see a link between the trade agenda, the regional integration agenda, and the industrialization agenda. And that manifests, for example, in value chain development. And so I think this interconnection between trade and industrial policy plays such an important role in the discourse going forward around our industrialization. But there's another very important link in the industrialization discussion, and that is investment. And in particular, foreign direct investment. We need foreign direct investment to expand our productive capacity, to expand also through public-private partnerships, our infrastructure. Because one of your other questions, Honorable Chair, relates to the deficit, the dire deficit in infrastructure. And it's infrastructure in the traditional sense of roads, railway, transport infrastructure, but increasingly it is about digital infrastructure. And one of the sad things we've seen during COVID is the impact on education and healthcare. These have been so seriously impacted as a result of a lack of our infrastructure. Communications infrastructure across the world has enabled children to continue learning online. In many African countries, that is simply not possible. But it's also an issue of competition, because in many of our communication sectors, we still have dominant players. So we do not have efficient competition to ensure that prices are competitive to make data accessible to every household across the continent. So infrastructure, regulation, and competition issues hang very much together in this conversation, and they are absolutely critical to the overall concept of what an industrialization strategy for the 21st century for Africa has to be about. It is not just about core manufacturing, because core manufacturing, if we look at clothing and textiles and automotive production or assembly, for example, needs services. The inputs, financial services, communication services, technical design, and so on, that brings us squarely to a discussion about the interface between industrial development and industrialization and services. So very important that we keep those linkages in mind as well. And this kind of discussion needs to infuse our AFCFTA negotiations, but also the flagship projects. Some of them have been developed quite some time ago. They need revisiting, they need recasting, recalibrating. Also now in view of COVID and the lessons that that brings. Honorable Chair, you also mentioned China, and you're right, this is somewhat of an elephant in the room. If we look at Africa as a continent, and for many specific countries on the continent, of course, China is the most important trade partner, and it will remain so. And what we've seen as the Chinese industrial engine has slowed down under COVID, the demand for our commodities has slowed down. So the impact of China in the global economy is extremely important, both from a demand, but also from a supply side perspective. So China, extremely important in this conversation. At this stage, the only African country that has concluded a trade agreement with China is Mauritius. And we haven't had sight of that agreement yet, but we know that the negotiations are completed. But we have no other trade negotiations with China, despite the fact that it is our major trade partner. So this is something that we really do have to look at quite carefully. Of course, there's a much bigger global discussion around the role of China in the global economy, the role of China in the WTO. We see discussions, deliberations around the relationship between the US and China and some of the issues that are raised there, but that's not perhaps the core focus of our discussion here. But I certainly share your emphasis to put on our major trade partner as a continent. And what do we envisage going forward? Are we going to make the approach to China to say we want to negotiate a trade agreement? What will the trade agreement be about? What about investment? We know investment comes to Africa from China from many different channels, from government, from state-owned enterprises, and also from private firms in China. What are the governance instruments that determine effectively how those relationships are conducted? Your third question, Honourable Chair, relates to payments, the issue of common currency and the online portal. And I think this really brings us squarely back to a discussion about the financial services sector, financial capital market developments, but also very important macroeconomic considerations. And the issue around monetary integration has recently in West Africa gained new energy with a discussion around developing of a regional currency, the ECO. And this, of course, is a very important step in the overall regional integration agenda. There are a number of regional integration, monetary integration initiatives in the Southern African region. We have the Common Monetary Area. 4 of the 5 SACU member states belong to that. And we do see some benefits, but we've also seen some challenges associated with adopting effectively a common monetary policy, where with South Africa being the major economy and the depreciation of its currency having impacted on the small neighboring countries. So it is an important step. There are some very positive developments associated with that, but we also have to be quite careful how we manage and how we craft that step of integration. Online portals, I think this is an area where there's a great deal of work necessary. What we've seen on the global economy, if we take a look at the e-commerce ecosystem and architecture, is the role of extremely large players, where access to those platforms, access to the marketplaces, to the market opportunities that they do bring, may be very difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises. The costs of using the payment portals and facilities on those platforms and so on. So the terms and conditions that apply to the use of these large electronic marketplaces, the e-commerce platforms, are so important. We'll have to watch very carefully what happens to Sokuku on the African continent. But what we are also seeing, Chair, is that there's a lot of innovation when it comes to e-commerce initiatives, the use of social media, for example. And we find that in certain countries, particularly youthful entrepreneurs, are developing essentially e-businesses via existing social media platforms and so on. So there are opportunities. They may be small, but for the individual entrepreneur, of course, they do offer particular opportunities. So I think this is extremely important to keep in mind. The issue around really, perhaps crisis is a dramatic word to use in the context of the flagship projects of the African Union. I think extremely important, yes. Some of them seem almost dormant. Some are launched with a lot of fanfare, but the follow-up, the funding in particular, the financing of many of those initiatives pose a particular problem. And this is again where COVID has been an absolute game changer If we take a look at the fiscal stimulus packages in parts of the developed world, they make an enormous difference to the recovery and the reconstruction, which is already starting now to deal with COVID. We simply don't have those fiscal resources on the African continent. So this is a huge problem. This is where discussions with development finance institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, but also other finance institutions, the role of the African Development Bank, the regional development banks, and of course, other financial assistance through our development partners becomes extremely important. There are discussions now coming up, I believe in October, I think it is, an EU-Africa summit to follow up. What are we going to put on that agenda? And I think these are some of the issues that we really need to put on that agenda. What would we like to be funded and supported as far as our flagship projects are concerned? Because keep in mind, the flagship projects are really the different elements of our continental development strategy. They have to link to one another, but financing is certainly a major issue. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Chairperson. We have two more questions, Trudy. We have Mr. Bani Karombe and then Mr. Sheunene Kurasha. In that order.
Thank you, SG. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, SG. Thank you, Chair, Vice, and Trudy. Good to hear this interesting discussion. Part of the question that I had was on the regional impact of the continental trade instrument vis-a-vis what has happened, but I benefited from the highlight that you've given also in light of the tripartite agreement, which seemed to have subsumed all the many arrangements that we've had across the three sub-regions. But I think taking it forward, in most instances, we are being accused of having good talk shops and nothing move forward. So the question of what is the real enforcement mechanism regarding achieving the objectives of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, because we should take note that the free trade arrangement itself would include issues of dispute resolutions. So the mechanism of agreeing on, or if there's a dispute relating to the rules of origin or competition arrangements and so on. So how are we likely to resolve those disputes, and how would states then rest with the arbitration mechanism that would be in place? So I think taking it from just a mere talk shop to reality, how do we move to that stage? Thank you.
Thank you, SG and Chairperson. Thank you, Trudy, for the presentation. My question is a question that a pessimist would ask. It has been argued that politics and not economics will ultimately determine the success of regional integration efforts in Africa because of inadequate political will and discipline by member states to implement regional commitments, partly on account of national sovereignty and national interest. In your view, how different is the AfCFTA, and do we have reason to be optimistic? The second question, Trudy, relates to one of the major concerns raised by both bigger and smaller economies regarding the free trade area is the issue of unfair or unbalanced trade. Against the background of the traditional accusations against the bigger economies that they have been blamed for deindustrializing smaller economies and behaving like a corporate colonialists by destroying local capacities and the general lack of capacity of the continent to produce tradable goods. Are there enough assurances, in your view, in terms of structure content and process of the African Continental Free Trade Area to address this concern. Thank you very much.
That's all I saw on the screen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair, if I may. And thank you very much, honourable members, for those really important questions. Honourable Karumbo, the issue of implementation has plagued so many of our regional integration endeavours. And you're absolutely right. To some extent, it's quite easy to negotiate, and I use quite easy because it's also quite difficult to negotiate an agreement. But the acid test, the real test of whether we are committed, of whether there's political will, and whether we really mean what we've negotiated, is whether we implement those particular provisions. And on that score, when we take a look at regional economic communities, we simply find a lot of gaps and a lot of challenges still existing. What can we do about that? And it links very much to Honourable Kurasha's question as well about the distribution of benefits and the unbalanced trade, unfair trade, the role of small countries and the larger countries who are likely, obviously, because they have the productive capacity to get most benefits in the immediate future. And these are all absolutely relevant and very important issues. So what can the AFCFTA do differently? What can make this different from what we have experienced already? Is there more political will now? And honourable members, we've got to keep in mind political will is really, really important, but it's not sufficient. We also need the practical capacity domestically in the institutions to be able to implement the agreement effectively. Our customs officers have to be trained. The capacity in our laboratories has to be developed. We have to have the capacity to do the testing, the certification, and so on. So the issue around the political will, it is absolutely essential, because without that, nothing will happen. But with only political will, we may actually still find that there are capacity constraints and challenges within our domestic institutions. And that's, I think, the fundamental point. Implementation takes place at the national level, not at the regional level, and not in Addis at the African Union. I think that's really important. It comes down to what we have in our revenue customs authority. Are the testing laboratories equipped? Do we have the materials for testing? Do we have enough technicians? Are our universities training enough scientists and technical experts to be able to do that? Those are the really important questions. So there's a lot of work that has to happen at the national level. And of course, there are financial and other capacity constraints that are really important. This is again where our development partners, but also regional cooperation can assist. So if one small country doesn't have the testing capacity or facility, could we look to regional arrangements? And I think we've got to think creatively about some of those issues. Some of this is already happening at SADC. Honourable members, you would know some of these regional cooperative measures are already working at SADC. But there's also some important changes that we can make when it comes to the monitoring of implementation. And honourable members, it's quite interesting that most of us belong to the World Trade Organization. And in the World Trade Organization, we have to notify when we adopt national measures that impact on trade, whether it be standards, technical measures, whether it's anti-dumping duties. We have to notify the WTO. And to be honest, our track record in the WTO in terms of notification is much better than it is amongst ourselves. Why is that? So this becomes really important when we take a look at the role of the Secretariat. It is mandated to monitor and assist member states with the implementation. So potentially it becomes an extremely important institution. More transparency about notifications can help, so we can see which countries are notifying, which countries are implementing, and which countries are perhaps having challenges to be able to implement their commitments. Then support measures may be designed and developed. So I think we've got to think creatively and really put the ball in the court of the member states. They have to notify. We should have more transparency so that we see what is being implemented and not. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. I think just to come back to the dispute settlement issue. So what is the enforcement mechanism at the end of the day? And of course, we really focus there on dispute settlement. The dispute settlement mechanism, as we've indicated, is very much modeled on that of the WTO. But honorable members, no African member state has ever taken a case to the WTO against another African state. So we are not active users of dispute settlement in the WTO. It is also true that even within our regional economic communities, African member states are not keen to litigate against another African state. And this is something that we really have to think around. What we have seen in some of our regional economic communities that allow standing for private parties, they allow a private firm to bring a case to a regional court, that some very important cases have been brought, for example, to COMESA Court of Justice and the East African Community Court of Justice, and also to the ECOWAS Court of Justice. But this is not going to be the case in the African Continental Free Trade Area. But we have to keep in mind, honorable members, that what we have at this stage can be improved on. The AFCFTA is not an event, it's a process. And the agreement says very clearly, we aim to progressively liberalize and integrate our economy. So it foresees an ongoing process. So we need to see where we stand now as a very important starting point. But we need to work towards that and to tackle very bravely some of the challenges that the honorable members are raising, because this will make either a huge change to the African continent or just add another free trade agreement to the ones that we have already existing in our regional economic communities. So I think we face a significant challenge. Is it going to be a game changer? And the potential is there. What the member states decide will actually be so critical in the next 2 to 3 years, both in terms of implementing what we've agreed, but also pushing the agenda. And the fact that, for example, the discussions around e-commerce have now indicated that we're going to add this to the agenda is a very positive sign, but we need much more of that. Thank you, Honorable Chair.
Thank you, Chair. There's 2 more questions. I hope these are the last from Ms. Lydia Macheli and Honorable Ruth Mendes from Angola. The Vice Chairperson. Kindly take the floor in that fashion. Ms. Lydia Macheli, and then Honorable Ruth Mendes.
Oh, thank you very much, honorable members. Thank you very much, Madam. Yes, Chair. My interest, actually, this is, I'm calling from Lesotho. This is a very interesting topic to discuss, and I think also it's timing, because we are now in this era whereby we have been affected by COVID-19, and it seems we are very far from being free from this. Yes. So I was just wondering whether we have looked at the security issues around online trading, especially when it comes to making transactions, verifying documents, and existence of some companies for authenticity purposes. What are we really going to do? Because actually to avoid trading with maybe companies that do not exist, that maybe the fly-by-nights that will be formed only for, gaining some funds or gaining monies from people, and then thereafter, now there's no supply, you do not receive goods, you do not, the commodities and all the stuff. After, now you have paid for what you have ordered, or yes. So I was just wondering, how are we going to deal with the security of maybe the clients, or the security of the information provided? Because even if maybe the companies exist, then there can be some scams and there can be some hacking of that information, and people's identity documents are going to be involved, somehow their bank accounts. And now what are we going to do? And what is it that is in place in order for us to feel free? Because we really need to do this in order for the world not to stand still, because maybe as SADC, it is not right that there's no interaction, but now we do not have choice. Now, if we don't have choice, that does not mean that we should fold our arms and do nothing. We have to continue trading. We have to continue growing the economy. We have to continue working on our countries. Yes, supplying the needs maybe of the nations or the needs of the people. So what is it that is in place for us to be secure? Thank you very much. I think that is my case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ruth Mendes. Is the honorable member still online? Portuguese translators, kindly alert the honorable member to take the floor. Okay, Chairperson, I do not see any other questions at this point. May I kindly hand over to you, sir?
Thank you very much, Madam SG. I believe we have come to the very end of this web conference. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in this web conference. Let me also thank Ms. Trudy Eisenberg, the Executive Director.
I'm sorry, Chair, can I intervene before you make your closing remarks?
We may indulge you, I believe.
Yes, Chair, I'm sorry. I was just waiting to hear the response from the question that's just been presented by Mema Chedi. So I thought you were just about to close. May we please get the response from that intervention? Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much. Ms. Trudy.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. Honourable Lydia, these are some really practical and pertinent issues related to the 21st century digital economy. And I think sometimes we still discuss as if the digital economy is part of the economy, a separate one from the rest. But if we really think about all economic activities have digital aspects, whether it be e-payments that we make, whether it be email transactions, orders that we place, and so on. There is digital components pretty much to any economic transaction that we make. So the issues you raised are absolutely critical for all of us. I think what we do have to keep in mind is that the AFCFTA, or any trade agreement, is not a substitute for domestic governance development. And this is so important when it comes to many of the issues that you've raised: cybersecurity, protection of personal information, data storage, access to data, all those kind of issues. But very importantly, there are also links to consumer protection and competition policy. And I think a lot of our countries are making good work of reviewing their current competition policy, their competition legislation, to take a look at how they incorporate consumer protection provisions or developing separate consumer protection legislation. So those linkages are very important. And of course, they are very important in the AFCFTA negotiations as well. So when we have the e-commerce agenda, the negotiations about the negotiations, what should be on that agenda? All of the issues that you've raised here are going to be extremely important. Storage of data. So if a major platform is gathering data about consumers on the African continent, where is the data stored? Who has access to it? How is proprietary information, personal information, protected? So there is an important cross-border dimension of the very nature when we're talking about e-commerce that has to be figured into the negotiating agenda for the e-commerce negotiations in the AFCFTA. But even now, we should be looking at the linkages to the negotiations on competition, on intellectual property, on investment. They all hang together. And in the services agenda, I've mentioned as well, financial services, communication services, and some other services as well. So what we really do need is a step back to think about what does our economy look like in the 21st century, and what are the important issues in terms of good governance to protect producers, consumers, innovators, entrepreneurs, to make sure data is not hacked into, for example, and so on. And what are the remedies we have? And many of the remedies will have to be domestic. So it's not a substitute for domestic governance and policy development in these areas. And I think there's a lot of work that all of our countries still need to do to implement effective consumer protection, data protection, personal information protection, and cybersecurity measures, laws, regulations, and policies that have to be developed. But thank you for raising that. It is so important for us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Trudy. May I check with you, Madam Secretary General, if at this point there are any housekeeping matters that you may want to share, or we proceed? In the absence of housekeeping matters, honorable members.
Apologies, Chair. I was muted when I was speaking. Apologies.
Okay.
Yes. Just to indicate that we are done with part 1 of our webinar. Tomorrow, we start again at 10 hours to continue with the second part of our webinar. We still use the same link to log in to the proceedings. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary General. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in this World Conference. Let me also take this opportunity to thank Ms. Trudy Heisenberg, the Executive Director at Trade and Law Center, for the concise presentation on AFTA. I am aware that plans are afoot to have a 5-year collaborative effort with your organization, and we so much look forward to that. Once again, let me thank you and also invite you to the continuation of this educative session tomorrow. I thank you.
Thank you very much.
I believe the meeting is adjourned, honorable members. Welcome, your Ambassador Jukli Fuku. How are you from Kenya?
Very well, thank you. It was a pleasure sharing in this information. We are fine here. COVID is rising, but we just live by God's grace.
Thank you. Wish you God's grace indeed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I hope I'll join it tomorrow again. If there are no clash with my UN programs as the permanent representative, I'll delegate that to my deputy and join you again. I missed the other week's presentation because we had also numerous Zooms. If you have a recording, please share.
We will share it, sir.
Yes.
Indeed.
Regards to the family and all the people in the land of the brave.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. All the best. Thank you so much, Trudy. Thank you, colleagues.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, SG, and thank you, honorable members. It's been a great honor, and I look forward to see you tomorrow.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.